I do want to thank you, the Buckley program, for providing such a great platform for us to talk about these important issues. So as was mentioned before, I am an economics student at Utah State University, and during my time there, I've learned a lot about free markets and individual liberty and property rights, and that's where my knowledge comes from. It comes from books and theory and facts. But my conviction comes from something a lot more powerful, which is my personal experiences and my observations. So that's my grandfather. His name is Kenneth May. He was from a small town in central Utah where he grew up on a cattle ranch. And in the late 50s, he decided to move his family up to Spanish Fork, Utah, a little further north, so he could start his own business. He became a brick mason. And he had a huge impact on his community and his family, even though that business was so small. Whenever we go to Spanish Fork, my dad likes to drive us around and give us a guided tour so we can look at all the things they built. They built churches, they built schools, they built houses, they built restaurants, they built gas stations, you name it, they built it. So not only did he build and beautify his community and the surrounding communities, but he also provided for his family and created a lasting legacy of hard work and of hard work. Like, that's my dad. He has continued on the tradition of Masonry. When I was in high school, I would have to help him all the time. That's me, breaking gender stereotypes, am I right? But I would help him all the time, and this is a foundation he's building for a house, and I hated them so much. I referred to them as hell holes, and I had a running count of how many. I think we're on hell hole 7 right now. It's pretty bad. That's me, breaking gender stereotypes. But I just want you guys to think about how different would our communities and our lives be if it weren't for entrepreneurs like my grandfather. If there weren't people to build and beautify our communities and help provide for our families, what would our world look like? And this unpleasant hypothetical is unfortunately a reality for many Americans, more specifically Native Americans. So tribal sovereignty is the inherent authority of Indian tribes to govern themselves within the borders of the United States. But due to overwhelming red tape and opaque property rights, Native Americans are blocked from partaking in the prosperity the entrepreneurship, innovation, and personal liberty creates. And unfortunately, tribal sovereignty is more of a hollow legal term than a meaningful policy position. The key to Native American development is not found in more federal funding and oversight, but in policies that clarify property rights and finally ensure true tribal sovereignty. William F. Buckley once said that there is an inverse relationship between reliance on the state and self-reliance, and Native Americans are no exception. So how is tribal land divided? So only 5% of all land on reservations is privately owned. And of that 5%, much of it is owned by non-Native Americans. 20% of tribal land is held in individual trust, meaning that Native Americans can own interest in a tract of land, but the title is retained by the Department of Interior, and the Department of Interior holds that land in a trust and controls everything that happens on that land. The remaining 75% is held in a tribal trust, which means it's similar to an individual trust, but instead of individuals owning interest in tracts of land, it's the tribe owning it collectively. Federal control of tribal land is the legacy of the outdated and racist assumption that Native Americans are incapable of managing their own land or that their cultures are incompatible with modern markets. Entrepreneurship, homeownership, energy development are all substantially hindered by red tape and opaque property rights. One of the most unfortunate implications of red tape and opaque property rights is the constant undermining of entrepreneurial natives. Studies have shown that there are 3 key disincentives for entrepreneurial natives, and they are poorly defined property rights, limited access to financial capital, and the arduous business licensing process. For time's sake, I'm going to focus on the first 2. And you might be asking, why are clearly defined property rights so important for encouraging entrepreneurship? While in developing areas, there are fewer entrepreneurs, and that's because of this concept that is referred to as dead capital, meaning that they have resources or they have land that could be considered capital, but because of the informal property rights regimes, they cannot use that capital to make their lives better and develop their economies. So, for example, since the Department of Interior retains the titles of the land, they can't use that land as collateral to finance business pursuits, which is an important source of capital for many entrepreneurs. And the clear property rights also provide transparency and certainty about transactions and their associated costs. So, for example, if a potential entrepreneur wants to start a business but is unsure how long the process will take, if he can even do it on his land, or how expensive the licensing process will be, then it's impossible for him to assess the potential profitability of the project. Federal control over tribal lands also creates obstacles to home ownership. Over half a million American Indian households, not individuals, households, have severe housing needs. This is defined as substandard, overcrowded, or cost burdensome. The Department of Housing and Urban Development established in 2017 that the housing and infrastructure in Indian County is severe and widespread. So why is this happening? It comes back to dead capital. Not only can they not finance business pursuits, but they cannot get mortgages through traditional means because they cannot use their property as collateral. And also, the utilities available on reservations are comparable to a third world country. For example, on the Navajo reservation, over 30% of people do not have access to electricity. This is because the federal government provides all of these things. So the rural nature and the limited utilities and the long licensing process makes the profit margin very slim for any private company, leaving little incentive for them to invest in reservations. So you can imagine there's a long, arduous bureaucratic process whenever anything wants to get done on reservations. So Native Americans live in houses like this in spite of owning some of the most vast wealth of natural resources in the United States. There's an estimated $1.5 trillion worth of energy and natural gas resources on tribal lands. But unfortunately, the federal government is blocking this from being used because of the long and arduous licensing process. People who want to invest on native lands in energy must go through 49 steps and 4 federal agencies, and this can take years before they're allowed to invest on tribal land. Off tribal land, there's 4 steps and maybe a few months. And I just want to make it clear that when I say that energy resources should be more available on tribal lands, I don't mean that saying that we should make them more available so they will be exploited, but just so that Native Americans have the autonomy to decide when, where, and what to develop, not the federal government. So there is Sean Regan and Terry Anderson, who are the foremost experts on tribal policy. They estimate that just a 5% return on available resources would bring in $75 billion of years for tribes. And so, but the multiple court cases have established that the Department of Interior has repeatedly mismanaged these funds. Part of the trusteeship that's that is this current institution, the federal government collects all payments from energy companies and pays out royalties to individual Native Americans and tribes. The Cobell v. Salazar was a 13-year lawsuit that culminated with a $3.4 billion settlement paid out to individual Native Americans and tribes. And that number seems substantial, but it pales in comparison to the number that Sean Regan and Terry Anderson have established. This is a perverse, land fractionation is a perverse inheritance law that was established in 1887, but for time's sake, I am going to skip over it, but I would love to discuss it with any of you after the presentation. Manny Jules, a former chief, said it better than I ever could. He said that markets haven't been allowed to operate in reserved lands. We've been legislated out of the economy. When you don't have individual property rights, you can't build, you can't be bonded, you can't pass on wealth. A lot of small businesses never get started because people can't leverage property. So it's clear that the root of the problem is the federal government's hands in the economy, in the Native American economy, which at least clarifies at least part of the solution. The solution is a drastic scaling back of federal oversight and red tape over the Native American economy. This is a uniquely conservative solution, but it is backed by research. Many academics and right-of-center groups are recognizing this problem and speaking out about it. Using this research as a catalyst, conservative lawmakers are uniquely poised to make a difference and finally release the Native American economy and allow it to do reach its full potential. Imagine all the problems that could be solved by entrepreneurs. There's a huge lack of utilities and banks and restaurants and every single industry on Native American lands that could be solved by Native American entrepreneurs, and they could provide for their families just like my grandpa did. And my family is still feeling the blessings of his hard work, and that's being robbed from Native Americans. And when I first wrote this essay, I said a lot of things like, now is the time for us to give autonomy to Native Americans. But someone wisely pointed out to me that autonomy is not really ours to give. It was given to all of us by the Founding Fathers, and it's merely being blocked, or it's being blocked by the federal government. The federal government is holding their economy hostage and robbing them of inherent rights that they have. Thank you.
So, Rebekah, I'm just going to go right to your research findings because you cite Terry Anderson and Dominic Parker, I believe. Mm-hmm. You seem to imply that Native American tribes do not have the competence to run their own courts. You appear to support Terry Anderson and Dominic Parker's research findings, and I'll quote, "Putting reservations under the legal systems of the states and facilitating better legal codes and better functioning court systems would assist tribes in developing land." Don't you think that this is a clear indication that tribes are currently incapable of operating functioning legal institutions? And isn't this a validation of John Marshall's observation that the American Indian should be a, quote, ward, and that the U.S. government should be its, quote, guardian?
That's a good question. And so the quote that she was referring to that I didn't include in my presentation, basically some experts found that because tribes have the option of having their own sovereign courts, which can be a disincentive for economic growth because that creates for many potential investors, it's essentially like investing in a foreign country. They're not aware of what the legal implications could be or what could happen if there's litigation. Does that make sense? So, Dominic Parker and Terry Anderson, they found that tribes that adopted the legal institutions of the surrounding states grew at 30% faster than ones that didn't. And this is a really hard question because it's tribal sovereignty or economic growth here. And by no means do I believe that the tribe should be forced to adopt the legal institutions. But I think that that's a different question than our tribes are incapable of managing their own lands. Throughout history, tribes have proven that not only do they have property rights, that's a common misconception that all tribes lived communally and never had any property rights. That's a gross misconception. They've proved over and over again that they are capable of managing their own lands and being a productive people. So there is that question of whether or not they should adopt the courts, becoming the jurisdiction of the surrounding state or not, and I think that should be ultimately up to them. I don't think that there should be any say for the federal government or for us to decide that for them.
So there are 84 Native American tribes, as you know. Do any tribes outperform others economically or educationally, or are all tribes in the same position?
No, so not all tribes are definitely not in the same position. There are definitely some that outperform others. A good example is the Southern Ute tribe in southern Colorado. So they were able to, they actually were able to start developing their land. I think there's 13,000 members of that tribe, and they're all worth like $1 million because they were able to. And so what happened is they sued the federal government and got a settlement. They got a big influx of cash, and they were able to use that cash to hire a huge team of lawyers, a huge team of engineers, and these experts to help them work through the system. And so if the Native Americans don't have those resources to hire lawyers or engineers or just to help them with the permitting process, then the process can be a huge barrier to growth. So they're the exception, not the rule, though. The vast majority of the poverty rate for Native Americans is almost double that of the United States, and over double. The unemployment rate is also over double that of the rest of the United States.
It's a very interesting topic, and Holly and I served in the legislature here. We've dealt with the federal grants to some extent. We certainly dealt with Common Core, the water questions, and the Native American tribes are something that doesn't come up. We've got our own situation with tribes in Connecticut, but it's not anything like what we're talking about here. To give Justice Marshall, let's say, the benefit of the doubt, if one were to say that the tribes were to be wards, one sense of that word is that it's a passing phase, that at some point you no longer are a ward, but you grow up into a normal situation. And it seems to me that there's a need for, and I preface my ignorance on this so that you understand where the question comes from, but it seems to me that there's a fundamental question about whether we develop towards bringing these communities in to function exactly like the rest of us function, basically, which in a way is what you're saying, that these federal restrictions on property rights and so forth should be eliminated. Or you treat the land really as tribal land and say, we're also going to get the federal restrictions out, but we're not going to give the rights to the individuals. We're going to give the rights to the tribe to let them decide on what form of government, economy, and everything else that they want to have. So would you say that there is some kind of stable, successful situation that we have to move towards, which has to either go in the individual direction or the tribal direction, or am I missing something?
No, I think that's a good question. I think one of the misconceptions is that all tribes are the same, that all tribes have the same exact needs, and that's definitely not true. So I think to answer your question, it should be up to the tribe of what they do. And if you look through history, before a lot of the European settlers came, like I mentioned before, that Native Americans did have property rights. A lot of the things they did communally were only because they understood that through the economies of scale, they would be more successful doing it communally. Things like buffalo hunting couldn't have been done individually without before there were horses introduced. So I think it is. I think as a society, we have this conception of Native Americans not understanding markets or not understanding property rights and not really being able to fit into the mold that we've created. But we do have, part of the thing is individual liberty. That's not for the government to decide. And I believe with all my heart that tribes have a proven track record of being successful, but despite their differences, and they will always be able to be successful as long as we give them the opportunity to do so. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that tribes are different. First of all, that's the biggest point I want to make, that one solution doesn't necessarily fit for all tribes. Second, they have a track record of property rights and of a booming economy, and I believe that they'll be able to succeed regardless of the institutions that they create for themselves. So.
I think it seems like it would behoove us to give the tribes the power to pursue their differences in their own ways and to decide the kind of structure that they want to have, which may or may not involve property rights, may or may not involve a lot of things. Mm-hmm. But to keep them, certainly the one thing that doesn't work is what we've been doing for 100 years.
Over 100 years, yeah.
Right. I think the senator hit on exactly where I was going. I thought it was great questions on whether you give the rights individually or as the tribe. And I fall out the same way, that the tribe makes more sense. But here in the Northeast, obviously, tribes in New York and Connecticut and other states, Maine, have been able to use their to make greater local decisions. They've done well with it. I mean, I think Elizabeth Warren's on the board of Foxwoods now, which is great. No kidding. But great wealth has been built. I mean, you're exactly right. But again, proposal-wise, what specific proposal? Are you talking about legislation? Are you talking about a conservative movement to speak to those communities? I mean, the most, and this is an apolitical organization. It's ideological but not political. But the most reliable constituency of the Democratic Party is Native Americans. Mm-hmm. Number one, the most reliable. And are you talking about is the proposal to build this conversation out and do research and papers and that type of thing, or is it federal legislation? The Supreme Court's gotten involved here many, many times, and they tend to be you can't say Indian givers anymore, but they tend to really not honor what I thought the intent of sovereignty was. Mm-hmm. But what would be the specific proposal that you're putting out?
So eventually the goal, I'll get to how we get there, but eventually the goal would be release all trust land into the hands of tribes and individual Native Americans. But I think before we need to do that, there are a lot of academics that are doing work in this area, but there needs to be more. It's a really young area that only has a few names that are working on. So I do hope to provide more research on the topic and eventually start speaking to lawmakers about the importance of this, just because I think a lot of people don't know. And so I think the first step is research and consultation, because this doesn't mean anything if the tribes aren't behind it. That's the whole, so.
Right, and to get into the weeds, we shouldn't get into the weeds, but say you say, okay, your land, do with it as you will, parcel it out however you do it. Or would tribes be able to drill without federal authority? That mm-hmm. type of question. Can you mine without the EPA? I mean, that's down the road.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people calling for different things. Just this week, I saw a tweet from somebody that, in response to the Covington affair, as we've started calling it, that if we really want to honor Native Americans, just let them be practically their own nation. That you need permission to enter enter reservations from the tribe, and that's a pretty radical proposal, that they become sovereign nations without any interference, any jurisdiction, nothing with the federal government. I'm not sure if that's the right solution. There's still a lot of research that needs to be done, but there are people calling for that, for extremes where they could drill without any input from the federal government at all. So, and then other people are just calling for the same rights as other citizens, so they have to go through the same process as anyone off of tribal lands. So both of those are very good proposals. And like I said, I think more research needs to be done about the impact of both before I can fully say which one is the best. And ultimately the tribes need to have the most say into what's the best for them. So,
if Google is right, there are 5.2 million Native Americans mm-hmm. in this country, and 22% live on reservations. So that means that only 1.14 million live on the reservation. Mm-hmm. So tell me how the other 4.06 million who are living off the reservation are doing economically.
So they're certainly doing better, just because they aren't. This property rights regime only applies to tribal lands. So if a Native American moves off of tribal lands, obviously that doesn't apply to them. They're not doing as well as the rest of the United States still, but it's just, for me, it's sad that people have to leave their home in order to succeed. There's no other way. And I think
a lot of people have to do that.
Yeah. Well,
that's
I know.
What immigration's all about.
Yeah, but I mean, this is the United States of America. I worked at the Department of the Interior last summer, and this is how I found out about this issue. I had no idea. And I was sitting in a meeting with some of the Bureau of Indian Affairs leadership, right in the belly of the beast, I guess. But we, and I kept on hearing things about trust land and all this, and I started looking into it, and I was like, is this the United States of America? Really? That people don't own their own land, that the federal government controls it for them? Like, that just felt so wrong to me, and that's what inspired me to write this. And so I think people shouldn't have to move away from where they want to live in the United States of America to succeed. That's
Yeah,
wrong.
I assume this has been argued for 150 years. I mean, if you live on those lands and you're a tribal leader, like, why aren't they driving this? Did they give up because they lost in high courts? I just don't know the answer. I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that there hasn't been enough focus on releasing the land from federal trust. There is, I mean, obviously, I think they're just really skeptical for some strange reason about land exchanges with the federal government. They're really skeptical about this, about courts. They just don't have any trust that it'll happen because the federal government, frankly, has a horrible track record. So, I don't know. I almost feel like they're a little helpless. Like, not that they aren't helpless, but they feel that way because you look at what's been happening to them since European settlers came. So.
A couple questions. When you talk about jurisdictions and you said adopting state courts, does that mean they use the state courts and the lawyers are within the state? So there's no way for them to develop their own court system. The second thing, if the Utes are successful, why haven't they tried to help other tribes? And the third question is, you seem to be hedging your bets here, and you use the word practically sovereign. Do you advocate transferring title from the federal government to the various tribes?
Yes, I do. And that will always be dead capital until they can own their own title. Until banks can use that as collateral to finance business pursuits and mortgages and many other things, it will always be dead capital.
So this, what you described before is piecemeal. You want a complete transfer of land title to the tribes and let them decide, create their own legal system, their own way of adjudicating?
Yeah, that's a good question. As far, like I said, the legal system question is really complicated because there are a lot of tribes that have their own tribal courts, but they develop their own precedents. So it's a really complicated issue. It's almost like a foreign country. Does that make sense? And I think that's great if that's what they want to do. But then there's the question of like the differing systems, how much that makes it difficult for people outside of the tribal court system to invest in that area. Does that make sense?
No.
Yeah, I know.
And what you're suggesting, all of this seems to be gobbledygook. What you really need, according to you, is a transfer of title, and then you
Yes.
would avoid this. The second, why don't the Utes help the other tribes?
And I think it's really easy. It's really easy for us to ask that question, but they're different people. Just because we label them all as Indians doesn't mean that they're all.
We do label them all as Indians.
I know we do, but they're from different nations. They didn't like when they would go to war before the European settlers came.
But the application, the land application, actually applies to and is relevant to all the others. So why isn't there some sort of consolidation about this issue?
I think it's just like they're a different nation. They're a different people. They don't feel that. I don't know how they feel to tribes from Connecticut or tribes from Montana. I can't answer that question, but it could be that I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, but that's just my preliminary guess is that they are different people. They aren't from the same tribe.
Thank you for your presentation. That was very informative. So as you walk through this, there's a couple things I was confused on, and hopefully you can clarify for the audience, and hopefully I'm not the only one. I think that it's relatively common knowledge that Indian reservations are, comparative to other communities, very poor. And the way that you broke this out with respect to property rights makes a lot of sense. These are some of the systemic issues that we see in poor third world and the developing nations around the world. Property rights is a huge issue that needs to be overcome in order to facilitate the establishment of a business. This seems relatively commonsensical, and as the gentleman to my left had brought up, I can see this it gets a little complicated in terms of the court. Given that you come from Utah, this seems to be primarily an issue in the western states. So one, are there any legislators, I'm assuming this needs to be within Congress, that have brought this up to a vote that are attempting to tackle this solution? If there is not, why would you assess that to be? And then the second issue would be, if you were to give those property rights over, how does and I don't want to mix your words, so if I do, I apologize.
No, that's okay.
That you would need permission to come into this territory. There's a lot of natural resources underneath those grounds. If you just give the property rights back from the United States to effectively its own sovereign country, how does that benefit the greater American people? So, is there a way that we could find common ground that allows for economic development but doesn't remove these resources from the American people to separately its own sovereign state, if I understood your proposal correctly?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, like I was quoting someone else when I said that it should be like its own sovereign nation almost, and as a proposed solution, that might be the right solution. I don't know, but frankly, this isn't really about the rest of the United States. This is about the Native Americans, and it even if there's not a direct benefit to us, it still needs to be done because it's what's happening is wrong. And I know I'm kind of diving into a normative issue here, but it's really, and any time that somebody else is growing their economy, our economy will grow too. It's like they're within the United States. There's opportunities for trade. There's opportunities for a lot of other economic benefits. Does that make sense? The number that I quoted from Terry Anderson and Sean Regan, that just a 5% return on available resources would bring in $75 billion a year. That, I think there was an estimate that would, I think it was like it would grow the GDP by 0.5% or something like that, which doesn't seem like a lot, but that would still, like just allowing them would help the rest of us as well. And remind me what your first question was again.
Yeah, so if there's any legislators that are currently or in the past that have tried to tackle this issue, and if there are not, why would you assess that to be?
Yeah, so there's actually a new legislation that came out that so they can so Native Americans can enter into agreement with the Department of Interior once they apply for an energy development license, then they only have to do it once, and then it applies for a long time. But the problem is that it's so complicated to get that not a single tribe has tried yet. They're just so complicated to get that. They call it a TERA. It's so complicated to get these that no tribe has succeeded yet. So there have been efforts, and the Cobell v. Salazar settlement, part of that settlement were other requirements for some programs that I won't get into detail now. I'd love to talk to you after about if you'd like to. But ultimately, a lot of Native Americans are unhappy with the continued practice of holding their lands in a federal trust.